Welcome again to this course on Christianity and the Enlightenment, the making of the modern world, making of modern theology. We are on lecture 17, and we are going to look at Montesquieu and Jefferson. In these next two lectures, so this one with these two gentlemen, and then the next lecture with Madison and Hamilton, we will be turning our attention to America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Himmelfarb, in her book assigned to the students, was right. The driving force in the American Enlightenment was the politics of liberty. In America, more than any other nation, we see the principles of 17th and 18th century moral philosophy, or at least a certain set of those principles, put into concrete practice. Now, sometimes we don't think of America and Americans as really participating in the Enlightenment. At least, I don't think that's how the story is usually told in American history classes as you learn in this country. The Enlightenment is seen as something that certainly washed upon these shores, but was really a European phenomenon with the likes of Locke and Rousseau and Leibniz and Voltaire and Hume and Kant. But there certainly was an American Enlightenment, or as the title of one recent book puts it, Enlightenments, plural. The difference is that America's most famous Enlightenment thinkers are known today for the political positions they held or the political offices they held. So you don't think, first of all, most Americans don't think Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Enlightenment philosophers. No, they think these were presidents of the United States. These were founding fathers. They were instrumental, Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. And so we tend to underestimate the impact of the Enlightenment and the way in which they were giving voice to and shaping Enlightenment ideas. And, as we'll see, they were also reflective of the tradition of natural law and assumptions of Christian theology. So we are going to get to America finally as we're almost through with this course. But before we get there, we have to go back to France. Most every American learns at some point in their history class about the importance of John Locke on the American founding, and that is well deserved. But many would argue that Montesquieu was just as crucial and critical, or almost as much, in the minds of many of the founders. So we come to, and I just wrote his noble name, but Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de la Brede et de Montesquieu. So we'll just call him Montesquieu. If you have that many names, it means that you were likely born into a very noble family. And he was a noble, prosperous family, born at the Chateau of La Brede, south of Bordeaux. Apologies to any Francophone listeners for my French pronunciations. He received a law degree from the University of Bordeaux in 1708 and then continued his studies in Paris. In 1713, his father died and Montesquieu returned home to manage his family's extensive vineyards and estates, just as most college students do return home their extensive vineyards and estates. Well, he did. In 1715, and this is very interesting, he married Jean Lartigue, who was a practicing Calvinist. We can only speculate if that had any influence upon him. Together they had 3 children. In 1716, then, he inherited the title Baron de Montesquieu from his uncle, and he began a career in law and government. In 1721, he published, anonymously at first, Lettres Persanes, Persian Letters, a satire on French society from the perspective of 2 Persian travelers. And soon his anonymity was spoiled, his authorship was made known, and it made him famous. He was already, as you can imagine, as a well-heeled nobleman, was wealthy, well-connected, but now he was a welcomed guest at the literary salons in Paris. And yet, by the end of the decade, 1720s, Montesquieu was growing dissatisfied with his current career and trajectory. He then sold his judicial office. He embarked on a 3-year tour of France, it's nice to know that all of the students all over the world who decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go backpack around Europe for 3 years and find myself. Well, I doubt that he was probably backpacking, but here he is, a young man in the 1720s, so quite a bit older than just a college student, and he wants to go travel through Europe. The most significant part of his journey was his stay in England. He regularly visited the House of Commons. He became friends with many of England's elites, and many scholars think that this was a particularly pivotal time in his intellectual development. Even though there were often English-French hostilities, we have to remember that across Northern and Western Europe, there was a free-flowing exchange of ideas, and many in England looked to France, and certainly many French intellectuals were Anglophones, and Montesquieu was one of them. I should say Anglophiles. He eventually returned home from his tour of Europe to manage his estates again, and he'd devote himself to writing. In 1734, he published a work on the Romans, not Romans, the book of the Bible, but the Romans. And like many of his contemporaries, he was very interested in ancient Rome. This is a time of, well, really since the Renaissance, but well into the Enlightenment, there is a great retrieval of Greek and especially of Roman characters and ideas. But here's the difference. Unlike many of his contemporaries in France, Montesquieu did not praise the Empire of Rome, but the Republic of Rome. So he was, on the, well, he was before Emperor Palpatine. He was that side of the Star Wars equation. He expressed his admiration for the Roman Republic, and in fact, he thought that when it became an empire, that really was marked the beginning of its decline. In the following years, Montesquieu devoted himself to what would be his crowning literary achievement, l'esprit des lois, the spirit of the laws. Spirit of the Laws, 1748. This was a unique book. His aim was nothing less than to provide a comprehensive analysis of the diversity of laws and morals that govern human societies and human affairs. The work was part empirical observation, what he had seen in his travels, what he had studied from books. It was part a theory of causation. And so he had ideas, which were very common in the day, that climate played a decisive factor in shaping a culture's understanding of itself and even their laws and their guiding principles. It was part a social explanation for why people and nations were the way that they were. Some people have said that the Spirit of the Laws was really the first work of sociology. Not sure if it completely fits that category, but there's something to that. But it was more than that. It was an attempt to find the underlying principles, that is, the spirit of the laws. That's the important word. What is really the animating force behind the way in which people organize themselves and nations structure themselves? Montesquieu divided political regimes into three kinds. So, three kinds of political regimes. There were republics. Cannot find a black marker to work. There were the monarchy, and then there was despotism. And each of these three regimes could be defined by their nature and their principle. So each of these have a nature and have a principle. So let's look at each quickly. The republic. The nature of the republic. That by nature really means power. Where does the power lie? That's the nature of a political regime. So in a republic, all or some of the people have sovereign power. And then the principle is what passion, what energy, what animates, what gives life to the regime. So the nature of the regime, where does the power lie? And then the principle of the regime is what animates it, what gives it life. So in the republic, he said, all or some of the people have sovereign power. That is the nature of a republic. And the principle, it is animated by virtue or by love of the republic. So that's what animates it. We love the republic. We love virtue and a virtuous republic. So the two go together. A monarchy, well, if the nature of the republic is that all or some of the people have sovereign power, then a monarchy is that one person has sovereign power governed by laws, governed by fixed laws. The principle then is animated by the pursuit and the defense of honor. So the republic is virtue or the republic itself, and monarchy is the pursuit of honor. Despotism, then, is one person has sovereign power and governs without law. So monarchy, he said, the nature is one person governs according to fixed laws, and despotism, one person governs, and they have no regard to any laws. And the principle that animates despotism is fear. So just a helpful schematic from Montesquieu to think of three basic types of regimes. Obviously, you could have others. You can have aristocracy. You can have oligarchy. We don't have pure democracy in here, but republics, monarchy, despotism. Now, Montesquieu wasn't necessarily arguing that republican, and when I'm using that word in these lectures, I'm not speaking to an American political party, but capital R, Republican, well, I guess the party is capital as well, but a type, a system of government, which we'll say more about in a subsequent lecture. So he wasn't necessarily arguing for this republic, which means a rule by the people through their representatives. So let's go ahead and give you the thumbnail sketch. Democracy, at least a pure democracy, is direct rule by the people, by the demos, by the people, by the crowd, where a republic is by their representatives. So over the history of the United States, things have become more democratic, and yet we are still, according to political philosophy, we are a republic, not a democracy. He wasn't necessarily arguing that that was best, though in the way he highlighted it, it certainly represented it to people as a viable option. And at the very most, he was certainly very negative about despotism. Let me briefly mention three important themes in Montesquieu. One, just some basic themes that will be important in the development of the modern world. One, he saw positive benefits to the development of commercial interests. Yes, commerce might corrupt some individual morals, but it can also transform international relations. And this is anticipating ideas that will be much more developed by Adam Smith. In a commercial society, nations need each other. By commercial, I don't mean the things you see on TV. I just mean interactions, financial commerce. Nations need each other, which tends to mitigate natural hostilities. If you rely upon this, if England relies upon France for exchange of goods, or so that they can import barley, or because they're important trading partner, you're less likely to go to war with them, because in doing so, you are undermining your own economic viability. So commerce in between nations helps to mitigate hostilities. And these ideas on the positive role that commerce can play would be important for Adam Smith in the next decades. A second theme, he's certainly a proponent of political freedom. Unlike Voltaire, who praised Louis XIV, the Sun King, Montesquieu was critical of absolutist rule. He favored moderation, he favored political liberty. Quote, "In a state that is in a society where there are laws, liberty can consist only in having the power to do what one should want to do and in no way being constrained to do what one should not want to do." So he was an advocate of political freedom, which sounds so second nature to us. Well, of course, how long did it take to advocate for political freedom? And yet, in the context of the monarchy in France, this was quite a bold thing to state. 3, and most famously, at least as we think about it as Americans, Montesquieu warned of the danger of concentrated, or the concentration of power. He was cited in debates surrounding the drafting of the Constitution. And we will have much more to say in the subsequent lecture about the separation of powers when we get to Madison, but it's likely, in fact, it's certain that at least some of this notion, which was so important in the American founding, comes from Montesquieu. Now, if he did not have a full-blown doctrine of the separation of powers in the way that the American system would implement it, he at least was proposing a doctrine of a balance of power. He saw there's a danger when power gets in the hands of too few people. So the way to make power more manageable is to have it more diffuse. So the more people who have power, the less likely someone will be able to exert all of their power over someone else. So the way to guard, at least one of the ways to guard against despotism, is to mitigate the concentration of power. If you have one person in your country who has all the power, and he can, and this is what the American founders are going to argue, and he can make the laws, he interprets the laws, he executes the laws, well, then you are setting yourselves up. You have to have an incredibly enlightened or godly person at the helm to not turn into a tyrannical use of that power. But if we aren't going to rely on the better angels of one's natures, to bring in Lincoln, then we must have power diffused so that there are rivalries of power instead of concentration. Well, that all is anticipating where we will go with the American founding, but these ideas of at least the balance of power are very indebted to Montesquieu. As you might imagine, Montesquieu was out of step with many of the other Enlightenment thinkers in France. And for those in the class, and you remember not only Rousseau, but D'Holbach and Helvetius, the philosophes, Diderot. Yeah, you're right to think Montesquieu, now he is a generation earlier than many of them, he is cut from a different cloth. And though he overlapped with them and was well respected by them and wrote articles for them, there was sort of an ambivalence about Montesquieu. By the time of the French Revolution, French leaders weren't sure if they should praise Montesquieu for his Enlightenment values, his defense of liberty, or if they should be suspicious of him because he belonged to an older regime and was not going far enough in the way that they wanted to remake society. Although an important writer in his day, the French nobleman would prove more influential across the ocean in an earlier than the French and a very different kind of revolution, the American Revolution. Which is bringing us now to Thomas Jefferson. It might be better to go to James Madison, where you see more of an indebtedness to Montesquieu, but we're going to go to Jefferson, thinking on this theme of liberty and political freedom. Now, this whole class has been necessarily general and overview. It has been fast-moving. There is no way to give a proper biography of any of these thinkers, let alone to explore their writing in depth. But now, as we come to some of the most famous men in American history, and I'm going to say our history, and if you're watching and you're not an American or you're from some other place, that's wonderful. I know we have several people, a good third of the class, or almost half of the class at RTS is not American, which gives a wonderful perspective. So if I slip in and say our, you'll just forgive me as thinking like an American. But as we talk now about Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, you maybe are whetting your appetite, expecting musical numbers or rapping or at least, presidential biographies. Well, we're not going to get into that. We don't have time to get into that. We really have to deal with just one or two big political themes. And while the whole class has been an exercise in generalization, it will be much more noticeable now with these three men who are more well known to most of us. Because if I just spend 20 minutes on Puffendorf, well, that's 20 more minutes than most people have ever spent thinking about Puffendorf. So you don't realize how much we're missing. But here, you may have read biographies and you had American history courses, and you'll realize I'm not attempting to give anything like a biography of these men. Remember, the course is about Christianity and the Enlightenment, the making of the modern world. So what I want to focus on is the convergence of Enlightenment ideas and Christian ideas and how they came together at the founding of this country. So that's all a big caveat as we look at the first in these three snapshots of these founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson was a quintessential man of the Enlightenment. He believed in progress. He believed great progress had been made in the prior century in natural and moral philosophy. He believed that better things were yet to come if we could but yield to, quote, the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. Jefferson was influenced by Scottish thinkers in particular. Now we're going to come to the Declaration in a few moments, and we'll look at indebtedness to Locke and to Scottish thinkers. But here I just want to note, because it goes overlooked for many of us, is that he was very well versed in and appreciative of what we might call the moderate British Enlightenment. At William and Mary, he studied under a Scottish teacher. This is going to be a theme. You maybe read the book years ago, how the Scots invented the modern world. It's a different title, I think, in Britain. But there is something to that, at least if the modern world is defined by capitalism and by the American experiment to a large degree. You're going to find each of these three men we're looking at from the founding generation were instructed in very key ways by Scotsmen. He studied under a Scottish teacher, William Small, who taught moral philosophy and natural philosophy to Jefferson. Jefferson was also an admirer of Lord Kames. We've talked about him. Adam Smith, we'll come to later, and Francis Hutcheson. The Declaration of Independence, as we'll see, was a summation not only of Locke, clearly so, but of the entire natural rights tradition of Grotius and Puffendorf. You can't separate from this whole tradition of natural rights, which began with Grotius, developed by Puffendorf, and on through into the 18th century. At the same time, there are very important differences between Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson. There was a bit more, we might say, of Rousseau in Jefferson, an agrarian ideal, a need, his famous statements about the need for revolution, the way they looked at the Shays Rebellion could be very differently. He was optimistic about the French Revolution until really the Reign of Terror finally persuaded him that maybe things had gone off the rails. He had generally more trust in the common man than Madison or Hamilton did. And famously, infamously, he planned to have thousands of copies of his own version of the New Testament sent to the Indians of the Louisiana Purchase. His version of the New Testament, of course, had removed any reference to miracles, the deity of Christ, elements of superstition, so-called. He considered the teachings of Jesus, quote, to be the most sublime and benevolent ethics, but the pure gospels, he thought, had been corrupted. And he wanted to recover the teachings of Jesus from the rest, which was like finding, quote, diamonds in a dunghill. So not a real high view of the inspiration of Scripture. He was deeply distrustful of concentrated power, just like Montesquieu. He believed that, quote, the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. In other words, natural rights and political liberty were never entirely safe from tyranny. Now, we're going to come back to this again and again when we talk about Jefferson, when we talk about Madison and Hamilton, that what is operative in their mind is we have these natural rights, we have this God-given liberty, and it is not safe. In our experience, it's not been safe. In the history of the world, it's not been safe. There is tyranny, there is concentration of power. And so Jefferson believed in the rule of law and limited government in order to safeguard those rights and that liberty. More on Jefferson in a moment. Let's continue with Thomas Jefferson. Oh, look, his name has magically appeared on the board. And let's look in particular at his most famous work. Undoubtedly, the most famous thing Jefferson ever wrote was not a book, not a pamphlet, not an essay, not an article, but a relatively brief declaration of independence for one of Britain's far-flung provinces. My kids in school have to memorize the Declaration of Independence, at least most of it, not the whole list of usurpations from King George, but it might do us well to just hear some of it again. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And of course, after several other paragraphs and a long list of grievances, it concludes with these famous lines, and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Let's just look at a few of these famous phrases. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So this is not rocket science. This is not brain surgery. These are things that should be plain and clear to everyone. Jefferson wrote at the end of his life in a letter to Henry Lee, the Declaration was meant, quote, not to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of, not merely to say things which had never been said before, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent and to justify ourselves in the independent stand we are compelled to take. He also wrote, our government is a composition of the freest principles of the English Constitution with others derived from natural right and natural reason. So he doesn't think, and the signers of the Declaration don't think that they are coming up with something new or novel, but they have taken the best of the English constitutional tradition. They have derived, Jefferson says very explicitly, from natural rights and from natural reason, this whole tradition which they were very well versed in. Remember, moral philosophy can seem like a new sort of field to us, but it was for so many of them the crowning course in their collegiate education, and there's a long history of instruction in moral philosophy, so they are well versed in this. So Jefferson can say these truths are self-evident. They were common sense principles. Now we're tempted here to think the language of common sense, of self-evident, that there's an influence of Thomas Reid, perhaps now not the full-blown philosophy of common sense principles, because Thomas Reid wasn't saying that government itself is one of those common sense principles in the American founding. But certainly the language and the nomenclature, which was very common, is picked up by the founding fathers. So these truths are common sense. They're self-evident. People should be able to see this. And then we look at the most famous lines that follow. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One scholar, Michael Zuckert, looks at this most famous section of the Declaration, and he highlights 6 truths put forward by Jefferson. And he groups these 6 truths into 3 historical phases and 3 corresponding principles. It sounds complex, but it's really not. So he says in Jefferson's Declaration, in this one pregnant line, he says we have a political phase, a political phase, and a post-political phase. And each of these then have a corresponding principle or point of action. So pre-political, all men are created, equal. This is pre-political. And so what is the principle then? The principle is that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights. Now this is very important. This is pre-political. Come back to this over and over again. It was an important point of political philosophy going back 100 years and found full bloom in the American founding. These predate politics. This is not given by any political agency or institution. This is pre-political. We have rights. We are equal. So the government doesn't make us equal. We are equal, Jefferson is arguing. The government doesn't give us rights. We have rights. We've been given rights. That's the pre-political phase. And then there is the political phase where he says governments are instituted to secure these rights. So we have these rights apart from politics, apart from government. You can hear echoes of Locke's state of nature. We have these rights. Governments then are instituted not to give us these rights, but to secure these rights. And the principle then is that they derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. And we saw this in Locke and looked at the very reasonable objection that many Christian thinkers might make today, and that is, how, according to Romans 13, can we say that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed? It comes from God. Now, whether you find Locke's argument persuasive or not, remember his argument was there is an authority that comes from God, but the legitimacy of that authority comes from the consent of the governed. In other words, Locke's argument was just because you have on your desk that says you're president or you are the major domo or you are the grand poobah doesn't make it so. There is this authority, Locke would have said, yes, it comes from God, but the reason in which we can consider it to be a legitimate, just authority from God is because of the consent of the governed. Whether you think that's good reasoning or not, Locke at least anticipated that objection. But here, Jefferson's not getting into all of that. He's simply saying, in this political phase, here's what governments do, and here's where their just power comes from. And then there is what Zuckert calls the post-political phase. So, if governments become destructive of those ends, then the principle is there is a right to alter or abolish that government. So he traces this famous section from the Declaration by saying, this is what happened before politics. We're equal, we have rights. Then the aim of politics is for government to secure these rights. Their powers derive from the consent of the governed. But if the government is destructive to those ends, it's no longer fulfilling the purpose for which it has its authority, then there is a right to alter or abolish it. Of course, Hobbes said there wasn't this right, but Locke said that there is this right. So let's look more carefully at this notion of rights. Those rights that Jefferson refers to are the ones we possess in the state of nature. When he says unalienable rights, he's not just flipping through his thesaurus for a nice word that's going to roll off the tongue of school children for centuries to come, but he's dealing with a set of distinctions common in moral philosophy. And you see this actually in Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy. Rights could be natural or acquired. So, your rights could be natural. It's something you're born with, something you have in the state of nature, or rights can be acquired. You get a driver's license, you have a right to drive a car, you have a right with your marriage license and what it gives you for filing tax purposes, just to give you examples from our own day. Rights can be natural or they can be acquired. Well, rights can also be alienable or unalienable. That is, you can have rights that you might have to or you might want to give up. They can be alienated. That's not always a bad thing. So for example, a common example in the 18th century might be your right to self-defense. In a way, you give up that right to the government that they are now going to be the ones to come to your defense. I'm not saying that, if somebody puts a gun to your head that you can't do something about it, but they're saying, well, you give up this right. You're not exercising vigilante justice. You have, in respect, police officers and constables and armies and all the rest. So that would be a right, but it's alienable. Jefferson is saying these are rights which are unalienable. They cannot be lost. They can be trampled upon, but as a right itself, it cannot be lost. Natural law theory often said that there were two unalienable or inalienable rights, and usually it was life and liberty. Of course, they had different words for it and different languages, but life and liberty. These are rights because they're also duties, and they're duties because they're rights. The two go together, and you can often speak about them with interchangeable terms. it's a duty to seek out these things for oneself, and if it is a duty, then it is a right. Now, added to this, Jefferson puts a third inalienable right. Now, sometimes there was then a third right labeled property. And remember, in moral philosophy, property doesn't just mean a plot of land, your 2 acres, which belong to you, but property refers to all that encompasses human welfare and well-being. Now, strictly speaking, we don't have a right to property. That is, you don't have an inalienable right. You're born and you have a right to an acre. If that's a right, how many acres? Is it a half acre? Is it 5 acres? Very hard to conceive of property itself as an inalienable right. You have as a natural right that you should have a car, you should have a house. So that's not what he means. Rather, when some moral philosophers included property, they meant we have a right to seek property. That is, we have a right to pursue human welfare and well-being. So Jefferson is well within keeping within mainstream British moral philosophy in putting here not property strictly speaking, but the pursuit of property, or as he calls it, of course, the pursuit of happiness. He doesn't really mean you have a right to do whatever makes you happy. You like to punch kittens, then go for it. You like to trip old ladies. You like to stab people in the back. Of course, the rights all must go together. And happiness is not just if it puts a smile on your face, you have a right to do it. But he is saying there is an inalienable right to pursue human welfare and well-being. Each of these duties, or rights rather, are derived from duties. Typically, remember when moral philosophy would talk about duty, this is very typical. You have 3 sets of duties: to yourself, to your neighbor, and to God. And, for better or worse, the Declaration is dealing with duties we have towards oneself. Now, since they are duties for all, they are equally rights. So think about it. If you have a duty to preserve your life, to maintain freedom, to pursue your welfare, you can agree or disagree, but just explaining the rationale here. If that is a duty, then it is a right. Because if everyone has that duty, then to infringe upon anybody else's duty is to infringe upon the right they have toward that duty. So what then? What about neighbor? Well, we don't have anything in the Declaration of Independence about duties toward neighbors. And that's because the thought is our chief duty relative to our neighbor is to leave others to enjoy these basic rights. And our duty to God, then, is to pursue, insofar as our conscience dictates, what we consider to be the duty we hold toward God. So it isn't that Jefferson or the founders think that these other 2 categories are irrelevant. They certainly are not. But what we can consider to be inalienable and institute into a governing system are these duties towards self, which then manifest as rights. Now, behind this assumption behind this view is the assumption that God's moral order is best nurtured when we each look after our own part. Again, whether you agree or disagree with this, trying to explain the thinking behind Jefferson's declaration. He's not wanting to ignore neighbor or say God is unimportant, but here's the thinking. One, if we don't attend to these duties, which are rights, and rights, which are duties, We are not complete moral agents. So this is part of God's moral design, that we pursue these things. And more importantly, if we don't look to these duties, we actually hinder God's moral order. Now, this assumption has bequeathed an argument that is very much alive today. Classic liberalism, which is what I would describe all of this, not as we understand liberal today, but classic liberalism, sometimes the foil for that is communitarianism. And classic liberalism emphasizes the rights and duties of the individual. Communitarian notions of responsibility, not surprisingly, emphasize our responsibility to the community. So how do we contribute to the common good? Well, in classic liberalism, the answer is we do so by protecting individual liberties. So if somebody had said to Jefferson, you are a early, modern, Western Enlightenment individualist who has no place for the good of community. Well, some of those terms would be foreign to him, but his argument would be, of course I care about community. Of course I want communities to flourish. That's what this is all about. That's why we have these inalienable rights. That's why government must protect them. Because when individuals are free to pursue and live out these rights, that is best for the community. Classic liberalism is not against neighbor care and neighbor kindness, but it would not say these are inalienable rights. Your neighbor does not have an inalienable right for you to bring over a pie. Remember the distinction that goes back to Grotius and then developed by Pufendorf. So rights, natural and acquired rights, alienable and unalienable. We also have rights that are perfect or imperfect. And this is part and parcel of the whole Pufendorf, Grotius development of natural law and natural rights. Perfect rights are enforceable by law because they are necessary for the existence of society. Imperfect rights are not enforceable because they are conducive to the improvement of society. So perfect rights are necessary for the existence of society. Imperfect rights necessary for the improvement of society. So these, you might say, unalienable rights are natural rights and they're perfect rights. Without them, you do not have a society existing, would be Jefferson or Locke's argument. Or Pufendorf. Now, Pufendorf was not downplaying imperfect rights. Don't hear imperfect meaning, well, really good, not so good. Rather, he's making the opposite point. The duties in imperfect rights are actually more virtuous and more meritorious because they do not arise necessarily, but voluntarily. It's not the sort of thing you just have to do, but rather are called to do. So yes, we must be concerned about the common good, but the common good is most helped by allowing individuals to live by their God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On the one hand, you might say this is profoundly unchristian because the most important thing is to pursue God's glory and our happiness in Him. And people are going to pursue happiness in all sorts of misguided, God-dishonoring ways. On the other hand, you might say that this is based on a realistic view of the human person. How are you going to have a society come together? Is it reasonable to think that everyone is going to pursue the same common good? Is it reasonable to think that everyone is going to worship God in the same way, even the right way? How do you make that happen? So that's the reasoning that the signers of the Declaration are making. A society based on individuals pursuing their duties to self is better suited for real life than one that says we have an inalienable right to be educated by someone else, an inalienable right to be fed by someone else, to be clothed by someone else, And that's why you could find broad agreement among 56 signers, from deists and latitudinarians to Orthodox evangelical Calvinists, seeing that there was truth, self-evident truths, as they saw it in the Declaration. Real quickly then, just to note 4 terms for God in the Declaration of Independence. 1, he's referenced as a lawgiver, not by that exact title, but the laws of nature and nature's God. 2, he's called a creator. We are endowed by our Creator. 3, he's called a judge. Later, he appeals to the supreme judge of the world. And then 4, he is called providence, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. And on the one hand, you might say, well, that sounds like a whole lot of deism. And it's true that it's not the language of the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. If that's all the language that we used as Christians, we would be woefully inadequate for referring to God as he reveals himself. And yet, have you ever noticed that the first line of the Westminster Confession of Faith basically includes 3 of these 4 titles? Here's the very first line of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Although the light of nature and the works of creation and providence do so far manifest the goodness, wisdom, and power of God, etc. Now granted, it's not giving titles for God in the first line of the Westminster Confession. But it's been pointed out before, and I think rightly, that lest we are too critical of nature, creator, judge, providence, the very first line of the Westminster Confession. In fact, it'd be hard to think that someone like Witherspoon or the other Scotsmen in the signing the Declaration didn't have echoes of the first line of the Westminster Confession. Although the light of nature, the works of creation and providence, nature, creation, providence, we see those 3 things mentioned there in the very first line. The standard reading of Jefferson's Declaration is that it comes mainly from Locke. Now, a number of scholars, most notably Gary Wills in 1978, pushed back, arguing that no, it's not from Locke, it's really from the Scottish Enlightenment and Francis Hutcheson in particular. And like a lot of revisionist arguments, there's something to it and it probably pushes too far. There are clearly direct echoes of Locke. Just to give one example, Jefferson's Declaration says, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right to throw off such government. Locke says, but if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, it is not to be wondered that they should rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected. So there are clearly direct echoes of Locke, and there are other examples one could give, though it has been appropriate to note that Jefferson owed much to Francis Hutcheson, to his moral philosophy, to even some of his moral sentiment and moral sense ideas, which lent itself in Jefferson to an egalitarianism and a trust in common people that was more sanguine than we find in many of the other founders, and we will come to that next.